It's a beautiful morning on the French Riviera. I'm Phil Liggett reporting from the Nice International Triathlon, an event in its 7th year and now regarded as one of the top 3 in the world. More than 700 athletes from 23 nations, among them 34 women, face a course longer and tougher than ever before. The race begins with a 4 kilometers swim, a full kilometer longer than previously in the Mediterranean Sea. From the Bay of Angels to the hills of the Maritime Alps for the 120 kilometers bike ride over the toughest course in the world. The race ends with the run along the seafront past Nice Airport, a 32-kilometer round trip to end a hard day. As always, the top triathletes are in town. The number 1 is Scott Tinley from the United States. 4 times in the top 3, never the winner. Scott Molina, another American, has twice finished second and once third. Victory also eludes him. He wins mostly in America, so how different is a European event?
It's much different. They allow a lot more vehicles on the course in Europe. They allow a lot more bicycle traffic, mopeds. There's a lot more traffic in general. The roads are a lot more difficult.
Leading the European Challenge is Dutchman Rob Barrel, who has won 17 times already this year and is one of the few who can be favoured among the Americans. This race, by the way, has never been won by a European. France has a favourite too in Yves Cordier, a resident here in Nice. Last year he was a spectator after breaking his collarbone. Rumours are he's back on form. Among the women, the strong favourite is New Zealand's Erin Baker. She won in 1985 but was disqualified controversially in 1986 after she received unofficial help along the route from her sister. Because of this, she gave Nice a miss last year.
You can't look back at bad business decisions, and that, perhaps was one for me or whatever else, but, I think this is a great race. It's probably the course that I like the most in the world. So, as I said, it's the best thing for me to be here, and I just look forward to race day.
Baker's closest challenger should be old rival Colleen Cannon from the United States. The two are good friends and train together, but Cannon aims to repeat her win here 4 years ago. And here's the girl who's tipped to head the European Challenge against America and New Zealand. She's Sarah Coote from Sussex in England. Sarah was second in 1986 and's been a professional now for 3 years. With so many competitors, getting them ready.
Hi everybody, episode 10 of the Streak podcast. That was the 1988 Nice Triathlon. There's a link to the video in the show notes. It took place on the 25th of September. When Phil Liggett talks about Nice being in the top 3 triathlons in the world, he's referring to what was called the Triple Crown by US magazines Triathlon and Triathlete. The 3 races were the USTS final in Hilton Head, Nice and the Hawaii Ironman, usually played out between late September and late October. I played this video because A, in this podcast episode, we are talking about something from 1988, B, because I'm kind of obsessed with these early Nice races, and C, a very big race could be heading back there in 2023. At the moment, I'm working on a podcast episode about the French Grand Prix Series, its history, the current format, and some memories from my first year racing it in 1996 for GT Vesoul 70. I should have it done in a few weeks, but it's taking longer than expected as I really want to get the details right about the wacky points system that they used in the mid and late 1980s. But to get you ready, today I'm covering some backstory about how I got interested in the French triathlon scene, essentially by reading 2 articles published in Triathlete UK in 1988. I've put them in the show notes as a gallery and in PDF form. More about them in a minute. But once this interest was sparked and I started to know a bit about how triathlon worked in France, starting in 1992, my parents would build summer holidays around French racing experiences. We'd send away to the French Triathlon Federation in Paris to get hold of a paper race calendar, use the key on the first page to work out the distances and the importance of the race, and then we'd spread out a paper map of France to locate the regions and towns. My mum knew enough French to be able to call the race organisers to get entry forms for me and my brother. Then there'd be a few weeks of waiting as stamped addressed envelopes and money orders were exchanged. We'd often travel to the race venues, still not really knowing if our entries had made it. But things always seemed to work out. For some nostalgia, I've put a link to a 1993 calendar in the show notes. Note from the calendar for people into the Kona qualifying process. In 1993, there were only 20 venues worldwide to qualify for the Hawaii Ironman, and only 2 of those were in Europe, Roth and Lanzarote. So back to those articles that I mentioned earlier. The first one was from Glenn Cook's regular column, Cook's Watch, which was published in the August 1988 issue of Triathlete UK. I was only 16, but my triathlon plan was to pass my driving test and get a car to travel the country following the Le Coq Sportif Grand Prix circuit, eventually getting good enough to win small prize purses to fund my racing. However, Glenn Cook wrote that to make more serious money back then, you had to race regularly on the continent. Cook's Watch explained that he had perfected the logistics of this. Leaving near midnight on Thursday from his Devonshire home, he'd fly from Heathrow into Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands or France. He'd check out the racecourse on Saturday and race on Sunday. After collecting his cheque for winning or placing, he'd make his way home on Monday. I never really did any of this, preferring to eventually move full-time to France. However, it did open my eyes to future racing opportunities outside of Swindon, Wakefield, Southend and Milton Keynes. The second article that sparked my interest was written by Carolyn Beardsley and published in the October-November 1988 issue of Triathlete UK. I'm going to read the whole article for you in a minute, but essentially the piece tells the story of her experience racing for a French club. Carolyn describes the club structure at Poissy Triathlon that provided kit, camps, accommodation, expenses and coaching, and a beautifully complicated method of classifying races and determining your national ranking. Importantly, she also discussed the prize money that was available and ways to get some by avoiding the top athletes. Carolyn's contact at Poissy was Kevin O'Neill. I'm pretty sure Kevin was the first British athlete to get deep into the French triathlon scene, from about 1984 onwards. I'd love to chat to him, and Carolyn Beardsley, about making contact with clubs and racing in France in the mid-80s. I couldn't speak French at the time, and realistically had to get some A-levels and maybe a degree. But finding a club in France, getting paid, and avoiding classic employment was already on the docket. So here's the article. An average triathlete abroad. Racing outside the UK need not be a mammoth undertaking, as Carolyn Beardsley discovered. All you need is a sense of adventure and a willingness to have a good time. There must be thousands of triathletes like myself in the UK, people who participate in triathlon for the sheer pleasure, fun and challenge, and who, being rather mediocre, will probably never aspire to greater things. That's me. But I wonder how many have ventured abroad to compete and to have a look at what's going on in the triathlon scene in other countries. I'm writing this article in the hope that it will appeal to other triathletes of average abilities, like myself, and encourage them to broaden their horizons and be more adventurous. Anyone who has been to, say, Nice in France and experienced the organisation, atmosphere and camaraderie between the athletes will have a basic idea of the French triathlon scene. My impression is that Nice is nice, but other French towns vie with each other to make bigger and better attractions of their triathlons. My running background was just for fun and very average, 42 minutes for 10 kilometres. And I was introduced to the sport after a broken leg forced a prolonged rest. I have the European champion of 1987, Sarah Coop, and Sue Webster, nutritional advisor to the British squad, to thank for showing me a whole new way of life. As we used the same running club, I had picked up an idea of what triathlon was about, but at the time thought that anyone who undertook such distances without a rest between disciplines must be mad. I did, however, secretly admire their courage. Unable to run for 3 or 4 months, I turned to cycling to reach and maintain a fitness level which fired my imagination. And the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to do a triathlon, to see what it was like. I'd never cycled seriously before, didn't know one bike from another, couldn't swim a front crawl, but could just manage 100 metres breaststroke. Does that sound like anyone out there? My mind made up, the first move was to buy a basic 10-gear racing cycle, which at the time was the bee's knees, and which I now recognise as having the style of a gatepost. But then I wanted no fancy stuff, not at those prices. I taught myself the front crawl, swimming that is, and persevered until I could manage about 800 metres. So that was all I needed. I could swim, I had a super bike, and I knew how to run. Watch out, world, I'm on my way. The Baldock Triathlon was going to be my first race, a 3.5-mile run to an outdoor pool for an 800-metre swim, another 3.5 miles run back to the bike park, all terminating in a 30-mile cycle ride. Was I confident? My only worry was that I hadn't mastered bilateral breathing for the swim. But undaunted, in I plunged. I really thought I was going to drown. People were swimming over me, under me and through me. And for a very timid swimmer who was new to the sport, it was the most frightening experience of my life. Totally unprepared, I wondered what I was doing there. But what could I do? Stick it out. And after about 200 metres of breaststroke, I settled down into the crawl and it became a little easier. About 3.5 hours later, I finished the course. Hyperglycemic because, out of ignorance, I hadn't taken any food with me on the cycle. But I was so thrilled with my personal achievement that I was determined to improve. The bug had bitten. For my first season, 1987, I kept to short distances, mainly because of my appalling swimming, and limited myself to events which had pool swims, no greater than 800 metres. Right at the end of the season, in Canterbury, I ventured to extend my limits. And that was the turning point. I competed in 10 UK triathlons last year, 8 of which were pool swims, and collected an abundance of medals and a few T-shirts. I'd seen the best and the worst organised events. It was not unusual on the cycling leg to take a little detour. And most of the events were held at such a ridiculously early time that there were few spectators and very little support. Such is dedication. But there had to be more to the sport than this. I'd qualified as a nurse late in 1987, but I had a chance to go to Australia in February this year to stay with friends and do some training too. By this time, the £150 cycle had been replaced by a £700 one. And I had a good idea what quick-release wheels and hubs were, and I'd learned how to keep it clean. Spending a couple of months in Canberra, just training, away from the cold English winter, is really what I prescribe for all triathletes. Training facilities were excellent, and I made full use of the 3 local pools and their masters swim coaches, as well as the video library at the huge Institute of Sports. Everyone was so enthusiastic and helpful. Even the local cycling club let me venture onto their velodrome. My swimming couldn't help but improve on 3,000 metres a day. And to test it out, just before I left, I took part in a 1,500 metre, 40 kilometre, 10 kilometre triathlon and surprised myself by coming fourth in a time of 2 hours 23 minutes, close behind a female member of the Australian cross-country ski team. And that is what I call an improvement. My original plan had been to return to England and have a bash at the Grand Prix Series, but a chance meeting at Christmas with a British international triathlete by the name of Kevin O'Neill stirred my more adventurous and imaginative side with his tales of life and competition in France. Apparently, there were more races with less female depth than in the UK, along with better organisation and support, and something called recomp, which turned out to be prize money. Kevin thought I could do quite well financially, despite my average standing, and after some discussions, I was invited to join Poissy Triathlon Club, based in Paris, to see how I managed with several races, perhaps even to earn a living whilst gaining experience. So here I am, still average, though somewhat improved, training full-time and thoroughly enjoying every minute of it, but broke. I share an apartment provided by the club with 4 other triathletes, Kevin, Frank, Christoph, and a crazy Australian, Phil Gable, who apparently turns up every summer because he, too, loves to compete in France. I was very much in awe of the French triathlon setup initially and of the club structure at Poissy, second in the French Club Championship in 1987 and current leaders. I had to pay £80 joining fee. This may seem a bit steep. I certainly thought so at the time. But I've already been compensated £50 for travel expenses and the race entry fee for the Marseille Triathlon for coming within the first 10 club members. The club is professional, with fixed wages per month for elite members, those who are placed in the top 17 triathletes in the French Championship. The club boasts its own training programme for athletes, physiotherapist, doctor, massage and sauna session, and swim, cycle and running coaches. Kevin is the running coach, who give individual training programmes in addition to structured training sessions. The sports director is Georges Belobre, himself a remarkable triathlete, who now coaches and supports his members at events. When I first arrived, I was whisked straight away to the south of France, where a villa had been hired for the use of Poissy for 2 weeks of cycle training in the Pyrenees. That certainly improved my hill climbing, as well as given me the chance to see more of the country. Back in Paris for a week, then off again to the Sports University at Bordeaux for some VO2 max and lactic acid tests in all 3 disciplines, and to have individual training programs scientifically worked out. This was quite an experience for me, and I found it extremely interesting to see what the top club members could do when pushed to their maximum ability. Back in Paris, it was time to work out my race calendar, and again I have Kevin to thank, because it is totally bewildering, with such terms as Coefficient 3, Recomp, Lots and Cat A. Briefly, all triathlons in France are either Category A, 1500 metres, 40 kilometres, 10 kilometres, Category B, 2500 metres, 80 kilometres, 20 kilometres, Category C, 5 kilometres, 180 kilometres, 42 kilometres, or promotional, anything less than Category A. Much more emphasis is placed on team results, and all events which are categorised have a coefficient, which is basically a scoring system for the French Championships in categories A, B and C. It's extremely complicated how each triathlon earns its coefficient, but it has to fulfil certain criteria set down by CONADET, the governing body. I still haven't managed to grasp it all, but as I'm not French, I don't count in the scoring. The women only have championships in the Category A distances, and as coefficient 3 is the most valuable, it makes sense for me to stay away from those races and athletes such as Chantal Malherbe, Anne-Marie Rouchon, Elisabeth Poncelet and Catherine Jay. As I was only here to gain experience of French triathlons, have a good time and perhaps make a bit of money, my events centre around the fact that the top French women won't be there, either because it's a low-scoring race or Category B, which they tend not to bother with, or there's a lack of prize money. This is usually £300, £200 and £100 for the top 3 women. But the men often pick up £700 or so, with the occasional £1,500 first place prize, with lesser amounts down to about 20th place. Having said all that, my first 2 races this season have been in Marseille, Category A, Coefficient 3, where a lot of the top women were competing, and at Avignon, Category B, where, so it seemed to me, the whole world was present. But what an experience! Marseille, as my first French event, was unforgettable. The organisation, build-up, publicity and support from the public, which is quite the usual thing here, resembled that of Nice, but obviously on a much smaller scale. The atmosphere was tremendous. Everyone was friendly and enthusiastic, and as Poissy were there in force, I had a real sense of belonging to something big. So after competing in Marseille, in the beautiful south, I decided I would like to remain in France for the season. I truly never made a better decision, for I took part shortly afterwards in the Category A race in Le Havre, with more superb organisation, and surprised myself by winning. To be led into the finish by the lead motorcyclists, blowing their horns in true Nice style, and then pick up £300 for doing it. It's an emotional time, not bad for an average triathlete. When I look back over my short time in triathlon, I realise just how far I've come and how much I've improved since those early days at Baldock and the short races. To look ahead to the Category B events I shall be entering in this coming season gives me a thrill. And it's not just the prize money. It's more the support and atmosphere and the enthusiasm and interest. These seem to be sadly lacking in the UK. To race here and see how much your personal performance improves from event to event is like a big adventure. But the most rewarding thing is how big the sport is and how much public support we have, not just for the elite, but also for those of us who aren't at the top yet. What I really want to say to British triathletes, both male and female, is that you don't have to be of an exceptional standard to venture into the wider horizons across the Channel. Nice is not the only option, and similar experiences can be gained from any of the 350 French triathlons planned for this year alone.
With the water at its warmest for years, the race is ready to start as 9 o'clock approaches. For the serious competitors, the prize list of $75,000 is their target, with the best man winning $12,000 and the best woman $11,000. There's even a Veterans Award as well, but for all of the entries, the real target is to finish. That in itself, the great achievement in the eyes of most who take part. Yes, the voice of René Tremoni says just 2 minutes to go to the start of the 1988 Nice International Triathlon. So the Bay of Angels in France's millionaire resort of Nice is ready to receive more than 700 athletes in the 7th Nice International Triathlon.
Thanks for listening until the end. You can find the show notes for this episode at thestreakpodcast.com/podcast/10. And if you've got a question, a correction, some extra historical information, or just want to say hi, you can email me at thestreakpodcast@gmail.com.